This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
We will get started. So welcome to this PhD completion seminar, which is always a cause for celebration as well as learning about a full PhD project. So my name's Andrew Fisher. And I am fortunate to be the supervisor of Dr. Natarsha Williams, the veterinarian who will present today. I'm here on behalf of co-supervisors and the advisory committee, co-supervisors Dr. Lauren Hemsworth and Dr. Sarah Chaplin, and there's Dr. Anke Weitholter, who are here today. And it's a pleasure to introduce Natarsha. I've known Natarsha for quite a while, and Natarsha graduated as a veterinarian from the University of Melbourne in 1991, and she has had a varied career, including mixed practice in Australia, in England. Natarsha was very focused on small animal medicine for a period of time. I think did a residency at the veterinary hospital back in the day and completed a master's degree at that time. In between family commitments as well, and Natarsha has also worked in the key role of a District Veterinary Officer for the Victorian Government. And her long experience with some of the situations that she found herself and her colleagues working with, I think has led to her interest in pursuing a PhD. Now, before I hand over to Natarsha, I also want to say that Natarsha came back to uni and secured a scholarship and commenced her PhD at the beginning of 2020, which going to commence a PhD was one of the more challenging times to start it. And so, of course, like so many other of our PhD students, the project has adapted and been managed to address the restrictions that were present for much of at least the following 2 years. So Natarsha has done an excellent job of pursuing her goal while adapting to the changing circumstances. And we look forward to hearing your presentation today, Natarsha. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for my completion seminar. With all the necessary preparations in place, I think we should get started. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to the land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend the respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. The idea for my research began when I worked as a district vet based in Ballarat. A large part of my role was investigating incidents of poor welfare affecting livestock. I thought there must be more we could do to resolve these issues more quickly and support farmers to prevent reoffending. Anecdotally, we also thought that the poor welfare was predictable. You drive through the front gate towards the sheds to perform a welfare inspection. There was something about some places that you knew just before you even saw the animals was going to be a shocker. You knew you'll be back next week, the week after, and probably next year as well. What was it about those farms that made us feel that those animals were at risk of poor welfare? And was that thought justified? And if it was justified, can we then use those risks to develop an animal welfare risk assessment tool to identify livestock at risk of poor welfare? And that's where it all began. So there's two main aims to my research: to understand the circumstance around which poor welfare occurs, and to identify risk factors that might be used to identify livestock at risk of poor welfare. There are four main components of my research, including numerous literature reviews, a review of historical animal welfare non-compliance events, a survey of industry, and a risk assessment tool study. To be clear, this study will only focus on animal welfare non-compliance affecting non-dairy cattle, sheep and goats in extensive farming systems in Australia. There are at least 10 livestock present. So what can we learn from what has been done before? I'm not going to provide a literature review, but instead highlight the main areas of relevant research. Firstly, there isn't a whole lot of research looking at incidents of livestock non-compliance in extensive farming system. There are a number of studies which report on findings from routine farm inspections completed by members of the European Union as a requirement under the EU legislation. These visits involve checks against EU animal welfare standards. Farms are generally selected for inspection based on a risk assessment, including recent upscaling or changing of production systems, or complaints from vets or others, and some are selected at random. There's also some great work looking at the human factors that may be associated with poor welfare, including challenges to health, financial security, age, knowledge, and adapting to change. There have been a number of studies looking to predict the risk of poor welfare as well. The majority of this work was based on pre-recorded databases with a dairy focus. There are also clear differences between Australia's farming systems and locations where the majority of the research has been completed. Farming is generally more intensive in the EU, often leading to some time of indoor housing throughout the year. Therefore, the specific animal welfare issues might be quite different, but it is likely that the similarities in the circumstances around which they occur. So why does poor welfare of livestock matter? Because what happens to livestock matters to them. Livestock are sentient beings that seek to avoid the things they do not like and work hard to get the things they do. There's a plethora of research that has provided us with the knowledge about animal sentience. Livestock are capable of negative, positive, and painful experiences, and those experiences matter to them. It's only complicated when we try and understand in human terms what an animal is experiencing. I don't think we need to understand whether a cow feels hungry like we feel hungry, or if they feel fear like we feel fear. I think what matters is that those situations are negative and livestock will work hard to avoid them. There are a number of building blocks of crucial research, including studies in evolution, physiology, pharmaceutical studies, anatomy, preference tests, cognitive biotests, and more. I believe the evidence is overwhelming that it matters to livestock if they're without sufficient food, a place to lie, protected by shade and shelter, without the conspecifics, harassed by predators, or exposed to pain without relief. And most importantly, once we know that it matters to them, we must treat them accordingly. There are, of course, other secondary reasons why livestock welfare is important. This includes costs to provide the resources to respond to those incidents. There's a human cost for those that respond, as well as the farmer and their families involved. I also believe that farmers with poor welfare have a higher biosecurity risk, with more porous fences and less attention to detail in many things, including biosecurity. There's also a risk to consumer confidence and market access. There's an increase in consumer awareness of animal welfare, and as expectations in respect to animal welfare standards continue to grow, particularly with our overseas trading partners, it's critical that we work hard to improve welfare outcomes, but they are currently unacceptably low. And lastly, and probably most obviously, welfare non-compliance is generally associated with a decreased production, which means less financial gain, and this can compound already existing money issues that farmers might be facing. Livestock production is big worldwide. Approximately 4 billion cattle, sheep, and goats exist in the world, and more than 1.3 people have a livelihood that, 1.3 people have a livelihood that depends on livestock. Have a livelihood that depends on livestock in some way. We mostly milk them, eat them, or use them for their fibre and skins. In some countries, they still use them to assist with cultivation. 34% of the world's protein comes from livestock. As you can see from the graph, the global demand for livestock meat continues to increase, and is predicted to increase for the next 30 years. While some countries have a decrease in per capita consumption, others have an increase. With increasing demand for meat, there is an increased competition for the use of land and water, with a tendency towards increased intensification and more welfare challenges. Climate change is also causing increased variability in season, and is expected to continue to impact livestock production, making it harder to maintain welfare standards. I've been lucky to be provided access to de-identified animal welfare investigation data from Agriculture Victoria, and I'm extremely grateful for that opportunity. AgVic record their complaints that they receive in the investigations in 2 separate databases, and so they've been analysed separately here. After a complaint is made, officers attend the property of interest and perform an investigation. If it is found that there's a breach of the legislation, the complaint is substantiated, and only substantiated complaints will be considered here. Looking at the complaints log first, there was 2,486 complaints, substantiated complaints of poor welfare impacting on non-dairy cattle, sheep, and goats in Victoria from 2011 to 2020. The majority of complaints received by AgVic came from the RSPCA, and another 35% from the public and 14% from government. Given that the majority of complaints received by the RSPCA are also from public, they are overwhelmingly the most common complainants. The portion of complaints about the different species vary between the months of the year. As did the total number of complaints, see here is a back line. The highest number of complaints were seen in August, May, and July, with the lowest number in December. This pattern follows what we might expect in southern production systems, with pasture growth minimal during the cold of winter meaning there is often insufficient going to spring. Then it grows rapidly in the spring, and animals are less likely to be food deprived in December of an average season. By year also, the proportion of complaints varied considerably for each species, as did the total number of complaints per year. The low number of complaints in the first couple of years may suggest that all complaints received in those years were not captured in the database. It's likely the decrease in 2020 would have been contributed by COVID-19 and the 150-day lockdown endured by Melburnians, reducing the number of people out and about. Interestingly, though, there was still a number of complaints during that time, suggesting that maybe not all complainants are city folk. There were some changes to the database in 2017 that might have erroneously contributed to the fluctuation in the number of complaints reported here. So what could be causing this marked difference in the number of complaints between years? Surely it's rainfall. The challenge of looking at rainfall is the lag of effect, that is the time between less than average rainfall to impact on pasture growth, so it becomes inadequate and livestock have insufficient and lose weight. The relationship between rainfall and the number of complaints were compared based on seasonal and annual rainfall at the level of the state, the region, as defined here by the CFA regions, and by town. The ratio between the actual rainfall of the time period to the average rainfall for the same time period were used to provide a better reflection of the difference in rainfall compared to normal. Seasonally adjusted regression was used to allow for the normal variation that occurs between seasons. The seasonal rainfall from the last 2 seasons and 3 seasons were the best predictors of the number of complaints, looking at rainfall alone. This is for 2 seasons, and this is for 3 seasons. The regression coefficients were negative, indicating that as the amount of rainfall decreased, the number of complaints increased. The variation in winter rainfall was the best predictor of complaints, and there's a small correlation with summer rainfall. Now we'll look at the investigation details for all substantiated cases from 1981 to 2020. The data included every interaction with the farmer, including visits to the farm, phone calls, letters, use of legal instruments, and prosecutions. The details were summarised by case. A case is defined as a person or group of persons that have had at least one incident of livestock welfare non-compliance. A case may have had numerous offences, and they may have owned more than one property. The aim of this analysis was twofold. Firstly, to describe and better understand incidents of poor welfare impacting on livestock, and also secondly, to identify common factors observed on these farms that might be risk factors. Each case was summarised by variables that were divided into 7 sections. The first 2 sections were developed to provide a way to summarise investigations. That is, the number of visits, time taken, the use of legal instruments, and the number of prosecutions. Secondly, each case was categorised by the main welfare issue or issues. The second purpose of this study was to try and identify risk factors that may be used to predict livestock at risk of poor welfare. In terms of livestock welfare, this can be anything about the farm, the farmer, their families, environment, and the animals. Ideally, risk factors are protective in reverse. That is, when the opposite of the risk occurs, the welfare of the animals is good. Using the information obtained from literature review, a little lived experience, and initial review of the first 50 cases, a list of factors was developed. While I won't list all the variables for the sake of your sanity, I think it's worth looking at a few of the key factors that were considered. This includes farmers who were absentee, unwell, used multiple properties, or properties where there was poor fences, failing to cull, wean, overstocking, joining all year round, or no supplementary feeding. Others included failing to mark, dip, drench, and where pasture was insufficient or poor quality, poor infrastructure, animals were injured, unwell, or recumbent. And lastly, farmers that were time poor, had age-related problems, financial problems, or unreliable at doing as promised or instructed, feed that was not proper and sufficient, and animals that without suitable supervision or were uncontained, required shearing and crutching, or where males were not suitably managed, were all included. Then I grouped the factors under the 5 main headings here. Altogether, there were 66 variables. For each case, I reviewed all the data entries and where I could determine the relevance or not of each of the factors and summarised each case accordingly. There was a lot of factors that I was not able to determine the relevance of from the information recorded in the database. Therefore, there's a lot of missing values. For the purposes of this study, when a factor had less than 10% of ratings, they were excluded from further analysis. This included all the factors about the farm, 10 about farmers and 1 about nutrition. Importantly, an absence of information does not imply the factor was not relevant, just that it was not determinable from the information available. Altogether, there were 7,179 cases. 66% of cases were resolved after 2 or less visits. 80% had an issue that did or could have affected the whole mob. 27% of cases reoffended. And of those cases that reoffended, 95 cases had 5 or more incidents of poor welfare affecting livestock. The data had been de-identified, but a town name was retained to allow for the cases to be density mapped. Although not all cases had a location recorded, the majority have been mapped here as seen on the left. This shows that the density of cases closely aligns with Victoria's population density on the right, excluding the Melbourne metropolitan area. 99% of cases involved neglect, failing to do something to care for livestock appropriately. Malicious acts were rare. More specifically, 85% of cases were due to a failing to perform appropriate management and husbandry procedures, then failing to treat, 65%, and failing to provide adequate food, 56%. In many instances, there was more than one area of neglect, hence they do not add up to 100%. As mentioned, there were a lot of missing values in the data. Therefore, all the percentages in the following slides only include the cases in which the relevance or not of each factor could be determined. The CWV is the proportion of all cases in which the relevance of the factor could be determined. In 57% of cases, animals were found to be injured or unwell. Animals were recumbent in 22% of cases, and in 56% of cases, they were found to be in poor condition. In 45% of cases, animals required crutching or shearing, 52% had insufficient supervision, and 30% of cases there was overstocking. In 52% of cases, there was a failure to wean or cull, 24% dip or drench, and 44% failure to draft. In 83% of cases, there was insufficient pasture, but only 55% had feed that was not proper or sufficient. 49% of farmers were absentee farmers. In this study, absentee farmers are those that did not live at the property where the poor welfare occurred. So this includes farmers that ran numerous properties, but did not live at the one where the poor welfare had been identified. 59% of the cases that were absentee owned multiple properties, but the use of multiple properties could only be determined in 32% of all the cases, so making it impossible to really determine the two different types of absenteeism. Using DSE provides a standardized unit, so the overall number of animals per unit area can be compared when there are different species or animals in the different reproductive states present. The base unit is the amount of feed required by 50-kilo 2-year-old merino to maintain weight. In this study, the DSE varied from 10 to 12,500. The average DSE of all cases was 613, but there were many cases that we couldn't determine the DSE for. In order to get a bit more out of the data, I looked at the frequency of the issues being identified on properties based on the increasing severity of welfare, and also on the cases that reoffended. The severity of animal welfare cases could have been judged a number of ways, but due to the large number of missing values, we used features of the investigation that could be easy to verify, including the number of visits, number of incidents of poor welfare, incidents that were ongoing or reoccurring, and welfare issues that impacted on 1 to 3 or the whole mob or herd. There were 10 welfare categories, where 1 was the least severe and 10 was the most severe, according to the criteria just described. All the cases were divided into these welfare groups. Number of cases in each group varied considerably. The first 2 columns show the proportion of cases in which the factor was relevant in the least and most severe welfare cases. And the third column shows the comparison between the two. In the last column on the right is the Z value from ordinal regression. The more negative the Z value, the better the factor is at predicting increasing severity of poor welfare. Animals that were found to be recumbent or in poor condition, or when carcasses were present, were good predictors of increasing severity of poor welfare. For all animal factors on this slide, the proportion of cases where that factor was relevant was significantly greater for those with severe than less severe welfare cases. For management and husbandry, again, all factors were observed significantly more commonly in more severe welfare cases. Unsuitable use of males and overstocking were the best predictors of increasing severity of poor welfare. As we continue with management and husbandry, failure to draft, dip, drench and mark were the best predictors of increasing severity of poor welfare, but all factors were predictors to some extent. Nutrition factors were similar, as the factors were more commonly observed on farms where the welfare issues were more severe. Feed that was not proper and sufficient was the best predictor of increasing severity of poor welfare. Lastly, factors about the farmer showed that having a manager and absenteeism was not more commonly seen in more severe welfare cases, but the other factors included here were. unreliable at doing as promised or requested, was the best predictor of increasing severity of poor welfare. The graph shows a non-linear increase of DSE as the severity of welfare increased from left to right. The average DSE for the most severe welfare category was 2,389, which is 9 times greater than the least severe category of 259. Then the cases were compared by looking at the likelihood of reoffending. Cases were more likely to reoffend if the issue affected or could have affected the whole mob or herd, or when there were animals that were injured, unwell, recumbent, stuck in the mud, deceased, or in poor body condition. Other factors more commonly associated with reoffending are animals that needed shearing, uncontained, improperly supervised, and overstocked. Also, a failure to manage males, wean, cull, mark, dip, drench, and draft were also more commonly associated with reoffending. Inadequate nutrition and farmers that had adverse behaviour, were unreliable at doing as they promised, used multiple properties, or experienced extenuating circumstances were more likely to reoffend. Cases with a DSE of greater than 1,000 were 3 times more likely to reoffend than those with a DSE of less 50 or less. Farmers that were not absentee were more likely to reoffend, and cases with a poor welfare impacting on 1 to 3 animals were more than 4 times less likely to reoffend. Using what we've learned already, we went on to ask industry what they thought the factors were that were more commonly observed on properties with poor welfare. The aim was to get industry to help us to identify risk factors that might be used to develop an animal welfare risk assessment tool. The risk factors in a risk assessment tool need to be correlated with the outcome. They don't need to be a cause of poor welfare, but they can be. For example, it might be that all farms that have binder twine holding the front gate have an increased risk of poor welfare. Or alternatively, farms that breed all year round may have a risk of having increasing poor welfare. Both of these issues might be risk factors, but clearly only one can contribute to welfare, while one does not. The industry included 99 potential risk factors. We engaged animal welfare officers, vet stock agents, private farm consultants, and extension officers. Thank you to those that participated in the survey. We had 141 responses, 91 for low welfare and 50 for high welfare farms. Participants were asked to provide a rating for how relevant they thought each of the 99 factors were for either a high or low welfare farm based on their working experience. These ratings were converted into a number from 0 to 100 to allow for further analysis. The aim of selecting risk factors was to identify factors that were likely to be good predictors of poor welfare. We used some stats to guide us, including comparing responses from high and low welfare farms, participants from the North and South Australia, and those participants with different occupations, to ensure we were picking factors that were universally popular predictors. The intention was for the risk factors to be easy to verify during any routine farm visit. Additionally, priority was placed on logical risk factors that made sense in terms of the impact on animal welfare. So risk factors like the binder twine on the front gate were not included. Lastly, we wanted to include a range of issues to ensure the tool was relevant to all incidents of poor welfare. The Animal Welfare Risk Assessment tool, fondly called the ORAT, was complete. There were 18 risk factors in ORAT that I've abbreviated here. The factors about a farm include suitability of the farm, fencing, stock handling, and feed and water facilities, and the suitability of paddocks for livestock to avoid injury and illness. Factors about the animals included gen animals being removed from the paddock, offspring of similar ages, males separated from females, and suitable stocking rate. There are a number of factors that consider the nuances of appropriate feeding, including the suitability and access to food, the ability of animals to be fed according to their productive needs. Lastly, there were 2 factors about treatment, including timely humane culling and the investigation and treatment of health conditions. The next part of my PhD is to look at whether ORAT is in fact able to predict situations where livestock are at risk of poor welfare. I'd firstly like to acknowledge and thank RSPCA Australia for their support for this project through the Hugh Worth Humane Animal Production Scholarship. This study had 3 parts: an observation study, the ORAT trial, and a feedback survey. So when you develop a new tool, you need to show that the method of measurement is reliable and repeatable. In the case of the ORAT, measurements were made by observation. The observation study was designed to test intra-observer and inter-observer reliability. The observation study included a series of still photos of various farm features that might be relevant in animal welfare investigation and were all part of the ORAT. For example, there was an image of fences on a farm with a comment, "For a sheep enterprise, the evidence of the farm fencing is suitable or is of an effective standard." Participants were asked to rate how accurately they thought the comment reflected what they saw in the image using a slider scale. Participants were asked to complete the observer study twice, no less than 10 days apart. The inter-observer test compared the ratings provided by one person on the same situation on 2 separate occasions. They were compared using correlation. This is good to strong inter-observer reliability. The inter-observer test compares observations from different participants on the same situation. They were compared using correlation, but as there was a lot of correlations comparing each participant with each other, they were compared based on a mean correlation coefficient as seen here. The inter-observer reliability was good. It's anticipated this would increase with training prior to use and some calibration between users. Now for the all-rat trial. Agencies from every jurisdiction that are involved with investigations of incidents of poor welfare are invited to be involved. Thank you very much to all of those people who willingly participated in the trial, and thank you to those others that helped me get in contact with relevant groups to facilitate this work. Participants did come from many jurisdictions, but unfortunately they were not as evenly represented as they might have been. Unsurprisingly, the majority of participants were animal health or welfare officers and vets. Participants were asked to complete the assessment after they left the farm and were advised they did not need to provide a rating for every factor for a welfare risk to be determined. The first half, section 1, was used to develop an algorithm and a measure of risk, and the second half to test the algorithm. So an algorithm was developed to calculate an overall measure of risk. We considered the information that we already learnt, like the factors that were more commonly associated with reoffending and more severe welfare cases. And then we looked at each case specifically, each risk factor, specifically. For each risk factor, we considered the direct and indirect impact on livestock welfare, the irreversibility of the issue, including the time, cost, and effort to improve them. Lastly, the chronicity of the factor, the likely time they've been going on for. Based on the criteria just described, each section of the all-rat was given an all-rat risk rating. This was a proportion out of 100. Farm and animal factors were given 30 and nutrition and treatment 20. To calculate the risk of poor welfare, I used the ratio of the actual ratings to the total possible ratings for each section and multiplied it by that all-rat risk rating, which was either 30 or 20. Then I looked at the relationship between the risk factor that we developed using the all-rat and the welfare rating the officers had provided when they completed the assessment. The first thing to note is that the closer the adjusted R is to 1, the better the predictive capacity. The adjusted R were all around 0.8 and very little with different proportions of factors with ratings. This would suggest it does not matter if the participants had entered ratings for all of the factors or 70% of them. The relationship between the assessment and the welfare rating was very similar. One of the challenges of validating a tool is that there is no gold standard measure of poor welfare in which to compare. Many of the challenges to improving poor welfare are those issues and factors already identified as more commonly contribute to an increased risk of poor welfare. This includes lack of planning, knowledge, money, reluctance to sell stock, poor infrastructure and fences. Other potential challenges to consider are those issues identified as impacting on farmers generally or those that live in rural or remote communities. This graphic is designed to show the complexities of poor welfare in livestock. It shows how the factors interact with each other and also compound to make the situation worse. Most factors lead to a decrease in productivity and income. And this is, again, a compounding factors for farmers, and it also might impact on their well-being. Lastly, if we look at the challenges facing farmers and the impact that they have on welfare outcomes, the yellow triangle includes some of, but not all of the challenges found to be facing farmers with poor welfare in the review of the historical data, literature, and survey of producers and other industry participants. In summary, it means that the farmer have either a decreased capacity or capability or both to care for their livestock appropriately. Please note I've included poor attitude as decreasing capability. This can result in a simple inaction like failing to feed, sell stock or mark offspring, or more complex situations where a farm is poorly maintained, making normal routine management and husbandry procedures more difficult to complete. In turn, the impact on endemic diseases like worms and fly strike are more significant. More animals are affected, and their gut damage and weight loss are so considerable, it's almost impossible to turn them around. So it's complicated. There are additional challenges that might be of relevance here too. There's a lot of research about the challenges farmers face, and the census also provides some valuable demographic details about livestock farmers. So we take these challenges that we have identified here and we add them here. So the ones on the left are the factors that we know were challenges facing farmers that have been known to have poor welfare. There's quite a lot of research that has looked at the challenges that impact farmers or those in rural and remote areas more than non-farmers and those in major cities. To note, this applies to all farmers, not just livestock farmers or just those with poor welfare. It is possible, though, that the farmers with poor welfare are overrepresented with these challenges. Unfortunately, many studies report high levels of mental illness, stress, and suicide amongst farmers, as well as cardiovascular disease, obesity, and diabetes. As you move away from major cities, there's a decrease in employment, tertiary education, socioeconomic status, population, health and support services, and literacy and numeracy standards. Farmers are also reluctant to get help. They like to show that they're stoic, spend little time away from the farm, largely work alone, and have lower education and qualification than those closer to the city. Looking at the census data from 2016, we're able to look at the responses from those that had self-declared farmers or workers with beef cattle, sheep, and goats. Comparing them to all Australians with an occupation allowed us to determine that they tend to have bigger families, more children, less internet access, spend more time volunteering and working, and have a greater requirement for assistance with core activities. 14 times as many farmers reported they were contributing family members rather than employees or managers. And 29% of livestock farmers were aged 65 or more. Lastly, farmers face other challenges, including climate change, were expected to continue to impact on Australian livestock industries considerably. Australian farmers are one of the lowest OECD member countries in terms of subsidies. Succession planning is tough as rural communities are shrinking and there are less services. Many young people are choosing to move away. The ever-increasing legal and reporting requirements, and there's a lack of skilled service providers that understand and can support farmers. It might seem that many of these factors are not relevant, but I think they are. As key farmers get older, their median salary decreases. Key farmers that have a higher tertiary qualification have a high median weekly salary. There's a link between literacy level and good health, and increased employment and income are associated with high levels of numeracy and literacy. Education extension programs to improve livestock welfare need to consider all of these factors to ensure that they are suitable for the audience. So this is where I package it all together and seal it up with a bow. There's going to be no neat package here, I'm afraid, but I'm sure we can break it down a little. It seemed to me that welfare complaints fell into two groups. 20% of cases were seemingly less severe, with an incident that involved 1 to 3 animals only, were resolved in 2 or less visits, and they did not reoffend in the data capture period. In 89% of these cases, there was a failure to treat, and 67% of cases, there was a failure to wean or cull. The other 80% of cases took more than 2 visits to resolve and or reoffended. There was the issue that did or could have potentially infected the whole mob or herd. Perhaps the ones on the left could be considered unfortunate but isolated incidents, where the ones on the right, which are the vast majority of cases, reflect a degree of chronicity and sustained neglect. I propose that the isolated incidents pose less threat in terms of community opinion, market access, and production loss. The larger group are where the real risk lies. As we have seen from media of live export, horses and acres and pig stunning very recently, the impassioned response of the community and the potential to impact on market access. All through this research, I've identified that farmers are essential in providing their stock with appropriate care. Although this research has not been able to quantify the proportion of farmers that face specific challenges, such as their age, health, finances, or knowledge, we know that many farmers with poor welfare are fighting their own personal battles as well. A multi-agency or One Health approach might be a way to provide support to both farmers and animals. Although, as the legislation currently stands, privacy laws makes this difficult. If we were able to identify animals at risk of poor welfare using the ORAT, that may facilitate early and sustained intervention until the risk decreases. In dry times, there are crucial points in which decision-making support could help in reducing stocking rates or calculating the cost and risk of carrying animals through. There's clearly a need for more work in this area to help the farmers themselves. The ORAT provides a measure of risk of likelihood of animals having poor welfare, given a certain set of circumstances. It's proposed that the all rat risk rating be converted into 4 categories as listed here. This is not black and white, it's just a risk rating. There are some farmers that will have a high risk rating and never have poor welfare, and vice versa with those with low risk ratings. If we look at an example, it might help to explain how I thought it might be useful. These are all the ratings in the ORAT. This represents a visual ORAT with a scale at the bottom and all the factors placed where they are for this given situation. It's the cattle farm. You're training for the first time. There are animals in poor condition. There is some poor quality hay remaining. There's a neat pile of dead animals behind the plantation. The place is run down, the fences are dodgy, and the yards are not suitable for cattle. The paddocks are bare, but most of the paddocks around here are bare at the moment. There's roughly 6-month-old calves scouring. We're almost in spring though, so hopefully the pasture will take off soon in the next few weeks. We complete an ORAT and it shows that the farm is a high risk of poor welfare. That's not rocket science. With the high risk of poor welfare of these animals, we might allocate more resources to this case. We might choose to use legal instruments early on. We might revisit more often. We might develop a more targeted strategy to solve the problems we have found, maybe even step-by-step guide to improve the issues identified in the ORAT. You come back for a revisit and the farmer has applied more targeted feeding. Supplementary feeding was improved and the animals have stopped slipping in condition. Back at 4 weeks, the farmer borrowed the neighbour's yards and sold some of last year's offspring. Back at 6 weeks, the animals' weight has stabilised. The farmers used the income from the few they sold to buy some better quality hay. You repeat the ORAT and there's still a high risk of poor welfare. The legislation is limiting here, as technically there's no ongoing non-compliance as far as POCT is concerned, but the risk of poor welfare remains high. So how can the ORAT help? Using the ORAT risk rating to justify a revisit, perhaps, as the animals are still at risk. Use your ORAT to discuss with the farmer the ongoing risk of poor welfare. Discuss with the farmers the specific measures needed to reduce the risk, that is improving fencing, infrastructure, control, breeding, weaning annually, routine husbandry procedures, selling stock annually in a breeding enterprise. We can also use ORAT to talk to the farmer about the barriers to improvement: health, money, time, knowledge, support, attitude, etc. Potentially, in cases found guilty of animal welfare instances in court, the ORAT might be used to inform sentencing by providing the ongoing risk of poor welfare. This process of informing sentencing is used in other offences, including domestic violence and sexual assault. The ORAT is not a silver bullet. It does not solve all the problems, but I'm hoping it might help to identify animals at risk early, to facilitate early intervention and extension, but also to identify those places where the immediate issues have been resolved, but the ongoing risk continues to be high, to work to prevent reoffending. The ORAT is not a black box either, where you put all the info in and the answer falls out, but still need to think and take every case on its merits. From here, I think the ORAT is ready for some field testing. And I think we need to look seriously about how we can incorporate supporting farmers in our animal welfare responses. I have no doubt if we provide the right help to farmers, improving livestock welfare would be so much easier. And of course, we mustn't forget, once we know what matters to livestock, what happens to livestock matters to them, we must treat them accordingly. Thank you to Aaron, Andrew, Lauren and Sarah, have all been the most fantastic support. And thank you for all the time you've spent reading chapters and papers over the last 6 months. Thank you for Anchor for being our chair and for making sure we get things done in a timely manner. Thank you to Richard, who has been providing extensive stats help and has been extremely patient. Thank you to Ed, who has spent almost as many hours at my desk as me. The awesome crew, Friday Journal Club, everyone at the Animal Welfare Science Centre and ARA for helping to make today happen. Thank you to my boys for being lovely. And thank you to my family for their support and patience. And lastly, but by no means least, special thank you to Scott for your ongoing support, encouragement, kindness, and patience. I've had the time of my life working on my PhD. It has been an incredibly enjoyable journey from the very first minute till now, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity. Thank you everyone for coming today. I'm very interested in your feedback. If you'd like to ask a question now, feel free, or to send me an email.
Thank you, Natarsha. Well done, and very timely presentation as well. So here's some applause in the electronic form. So well done. Well done. We have time for some questions or comments. There's a lot to, I think, explore here. It's a really important topic. So yes, would someone like to perhaps open up and raise a question for Natarsha to address. I can't see the whole screen here. Yeah, does anyone want to, you can put your hand up, you can put it in the chat. I think you can possibly even unmute yourself to ask a question.
Just a couple of questions, Andrew.
Oh, good. Okay, I've got some. Okay, thank you for raising your hands. I think Mandy McLeod, you were first. Would you like to ask your question, please, Mandy?
Natarsha, what a great presentation. Obviously a huge piece of work and very challenging to put it all together. The graphics were incredible and I think there's a huge amount to unpack. So I'm going to be one of those people that'll ask questions later, but I just wanted to say well done. Fabulous piece of work.
Thanks, Mandy. Cheers.
I think it's notable, Natarsha, you've got people and comments from obviously very much in the sector as well, not just from within the university. So a lot of people from people, you know, out in the field who are involved in this. Sarah, I think you had your hand up, Sarah Chaplin, for a question.
I did. Yeah, we can actually have a conversation. So obviously you were disrupted early on by COVID. Have you achieved everything you wanted to achieve in your PhD? And if you had the magic wand, what else would you do?
I think I have achieved everything I wanted to achieve. Yes, I think if I have a magic wand, I'd like to be able to do some field trials, and I've included that into the final write-up, I suppose, so like the last sort of test. But I'm fairly happy we got to a good point. I think it looks fairly convincing that it's going to be good.
Do you have an idea what those field trials might look like?
Roughly, yeah. The problem with, as I said before, there's no gold standard for measuring animal welfare, so we've got nothing to compare against. So any field trial will probably be largely qualitative. So we'd form the assessment, then talk to those people that have been to the farm, you know, look at the previous information about that case and sort of have a chat about it rather than it being an objective measurement per se. Just because it's the nature of the beast, we haven't got an answer. There's no box somewhere, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Other questions or comments for Natarsha? Natarsha, I might quickly jump in with one here. You're obviously fortunate to be able to use extensive records from different jurisdictions. Were there, on the sort of different jurisdictions that you could use, were there sort of state-to-state differences in how cases presented, or was there sort of a fair degree of commonality about some of the factors that you identified?
Definitely commonality, Andrew, particularly when we're looking to select factors for the ORAT. I compared deliberately the north and south of Australia, so north, top of Australia and the south of Australia, to compare because it's completely different farming systems. And there was no significant difference between the ratings for the north and south for all the factors that were in the ORAT. So although, you know, they're completely different farming systems, I think there was pretty huge commonality there. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's useful to know and enhances the applicability, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah. I know you're here, so I'm going to put you on the spot. Richard Shepherd, thank you very much for obviously your key role. Would you like to perhaps make a few comments from your perspective on what the project's shown and so forth?
Still Matt's thunder, but just to say that it's a very complicated space, and you can measure many things, and what Nat's managed to come up with is a very robust tool that, whilst it's difficult to test because there's no gold standard, I think is going to prove to be very, very useful, exactly as she's presented it. So, yeah, I mean, you can measure all sorts of things here, and it's actually working out what are the most valuable and meaningful predictors has been the challenge, and she's done a great job.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, that's very good to hear. Sarah, I think you've got your hand up again, and then I'll go to Mandy after that.
Shouldn't really have any questions after all this time, should I, Natarsha? Were there any surprises?
I think the main surprise was that the North and South were agreeance on all of those factors. I thought there might be some quite significant differences. I might not be able to balance that, but yeah, I was pretty excited and a bit surprised to be able to see that they were both consistent, yeah, from both areas.
And any factors that were in or out that surprised you?
I think I mean, the complication came with the human factors, because we did have human factors when we asked the industry what they thought were relevant for selecting for the ORAT, and they were pretty unanimous that they weren't sure or didn't think they were relevant. And in hindsight, I believe that including human factors in the ORAT was wrong anyway, because I think it's better to measure risk without looking at the person. Obviously, looking at the farm reflects how the person is coping and what they've been doing, and that's probably enough. I don't think asking questions about the person is right in hindsight.
Thanks.
So often we all have our biases, and we look for confirmation when we look at people sometimes of our biases.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
There's a question in the chat from Mandy. Natarsha, what do you think needs to happen for this to help us protect animals before their welfare is really compromised? So I think it's what needs to happen next to try and make a difference on the ground.
I mean, the people that respond to these incidents work incredibly hard, and it's incredibly frustrating. But I think part of the problem is the legislation. If we're relying on legislation, we run out of legislation. And as the example I gave, I mean, once there is no non-compliance remaining, the risk to those animals remains. So I'm hoping the tool will be able to identify those animals at risk. And it might be that, you go to a farm for a non-welfare related reason, and you finish an ORAT when you go and realise that animals are probably a high risk of reoffending. So what can we do to interfere early? Perhaps we can, extension early and say, these animals are high risk. I know they are. We've done an ORAT and we know they're at high risk. So what can we do to reduce that risk? And sometimes it's really complicated. There's no doubt about that. But, we've got to be able to have those conversations. And if we can get in early before, half the mob dies, that's got to be a better thing.
Very good. Okay, we've got a couple of questions. I'll do one with the chat first, and then I'll go to Helen Beattie after that. So Kat Littlewood from New Zealand, who is actually a fellow of the Australian New Zealand College in Animal Welfare, asks, can your protocol be used over here in New Zealand?
I think it probably could, Kat, just because of similarities in extensive. It's designed to be just extensive farming systems and non-dairy, because the dairy systems are just so incredibly different. But I think the similarities would be there. We'd obviously have to do a little bit of testing to start with to make sure. But I think, yes, much more adaptable to New Zealand than perhaps to the EU or the UK. Yeah.
Okay, and we might go, perhaps it's not too many more questions, so it might be the last question. Helen Beattie, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Thank you. My question is now redundant because it was going to be the same as Kat's question, so you can take another one. But yeah, it's great work, and it would be awesome to roll this out here and see what we got and how relevant it was, because certainly this is fascinating to see the breakdown, and it would be great to know what's happening here on shore as well. So yeah, well done. Come on over.
Thank you.
Very good. Are there any other questions before we wrap it up? No, look, Natarsha, congratulations. I know you're very close to pulling it all together and submitting the thesis. It's been quite a journey. I think you've done it with such dedication and commitment, and passion for the area. And I think that's really shone through today. And I think everyone has really appreciated this presentation. So thank you very much. Well done. We look forward to what happens from here as well in making a difference. So congratulations, and thank you very much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone, for coming.